Hi everyone. Welcome to English Story School. Part 1. The question that starts it all. What would you do if today was the last day you'd ever be poor? Not tomorrow. Not next week. Not someday. Today. Imagine waking up, still broke, still behind on bills, still surviving on the cheapest food you could find. Yet suddenly, something inside of you shifts. Something burns. You open your eyes to the same world, but for the first time, you feel the fire that whispers, "This is it. No more." Daniel was 28, trapped in a life that felt smaller than his own shadow. He lived in a narrow, decaying apartment where the paint peeled off the walls like dried scabs, and the sound of his neighbor's TV seemed louder than his own heartbeat. The air smelled faintly of dust and hopelessness. His fridge contained only 3 things: a half-empty bottle of sour milk, 2 eggs clinging to the last bit of freshness, and a packet of instant noodles. His dinner for the 3rd night in a row. His rent was overdue again. His shoes were worn thin, the soles so cracked that rainwater slid in with every step. But worse than the cracks in his shoes were the cracks in his dreams. The boy who once believed he could change the world had become a man who struggled to change his socks. And yet, on that freezing December morning, something extraordinary happened. Daniel woke up not as a victim of his circumstances, but as a man standing at a crossroad. He dragged himself to the cracked mirror above the bathroom sink. The reflection staring back wasn't impressive. Tired eyes, unshaven beard, shoulders bent with silent defeat. But then a spark. He leaned closer, squinting at the mirror. For the first time, he didn't just see who he was. He saw who he could become. That vision wasn't faint, it was fierce. A stronger man, a freer man, a man who refused to kneel before life's cruelty. And in that moment, Daniel made a decision, not a casual thought, not a weak promise, but a vow forged in the marrow of his bones. I will never be poor again. They say, a decision changes everything if you make it with your soul. And Daniel's soul was screaming. His decision wasn't born from comfort, but from hunger, the hunger that only desperation can carve into your gut. He dropped his head into his hands, his palms rough against his skin. The room was cold, yet inside him burned a furnace. His mind raced. What does it mean to never be poor again? It didn't just mean money. It meant dignity, freedom, the ability to stand tall, to no longer beg life for scraps, but to demand his place in it. Poverty is not just the lack of money, he whispered to himself. It's the lack of choices, and he was done being choiceless. The decision didn't make his problems vanish. The bills still sat on the counter, the landlord would still knock, and the fridge was still empty. But something inside Daniel had shifted forever. That shift was invisible to the world, but to him, it was everything. He remembered a quote he once read in a torn secondhand book. Rock bottom became the solid foundation on which I rebuilt my life. J.K. Rowling. And that morning, Daniel knew he had hit his rock bottom, which meant there was only one direction left to go, up. He pulled on his frayed jacket and stepped outside. The air bit at his skin, sharp and merciless, but Daniel welcomed it. Every gust of icy wind reminded him he was alive, and that was enough to fight. He walked past the bakery down the street, the smell of fresh bread twisting his empty stomach into knots. Once, that smell would have filled him with bitterness. Today, it filled him with determination. He thought of the people who had laughed at him, the bosses who paid him pennies and discarded him like trash, the friends who had disappeared when he had nothing to offer. They all became fuel in the fire, now raging inside him. He muttered under his breath, "Thank you, because you showed me who I'll never be again." Each step he took down the cracked sidewalk was heavy with past failure, but lightened by new resolve. His mind painted pictures of what life could be: paying off debts, eating without guilt, wearing shoes without holes, maybe even helping others trapped where he once was. But dreams alone wouldn't save him. He knew that. He wasn't looking for a miracle, because he understood miracles were made, not given. Discipline weighs ounces, regret weighs tons. He recalled from an old motivational tape he once heard. And Daniel refused to carry regret anymore. By the time he returned to his apartment, the sun had risen fully. Golden light spilled across his messy room, almost mocking the chaos. He stood in the middle of it, fists clenched, chest heaving with the intensity of his vow. Poverty would no longer define him. Struggle would no longer chain him. From this day forward, he wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. And that fight, though brutal, would be the greatest story of his life. Because it all began with one burning, soul-deep decision. I will never be poor again. Part 2, the fire that ignites. The first thing Daniel did was destroy the very thing that had kept him chained for years: his excuses. Excuses were soft pillows for a restless man. They gave him comfort while killing his fire. And Daniel knew if he wanted to rise, he had to rip that pillow apart and breathe in the raw, cold air of truth. So he grabbed an old notepad, pages yellowed and bent at the edges, and began to write. Line after line, reason after reason, every excuse that had ever kept him from trying. I don't have the right education. I don't have money. I don't know the right people. I'm not lucky enough. The list went on until the paper sagged heavy with all the poison of his past beliefs. Then, with trembling hands but unshakable intent, he lit the stove flame. The fire hissed and crackled, hungry like his soul. One by one, he fed each page to the flame. The ink curled, the paper blackened, and smoke rose like the ghost of his old self disappearing into the ceiling. His excuses screamed their last breath as ash fell onto the cold stove top. He whispered to himself, voice shaking but fierce, "Burn your excuses or burn your future." For Daniel, that wasn't just a quote. It was a warning carved into his bones. He didn't have money for expensive courses, glossy seminars, or high-priced mentors. But he did have 3 weapons: an internet connection, a library card, and an insane hunger to learn. That hunger became his fuel. Every morning, long before the city's alarm screamed, before the buses rumbled down the streets, before the coffee shops opened, Daniel was already awake. At his kitchen table, the same table scarred with stains and scratches, he sat with a chipped mug of cheap black coffee. The bitter liquid seared his throat, but he welcomed the sting. It reminded him that comfort was dead, that he had chosen pain over paralysis. In front of him lay books from the dusty shelves of the public library: business, psychology, investing, biographies of people who had clawed their way out of nothing. He devoured them like a starving man. Every page gave him new thoughts. Every sentence carved a new scar of determination. His mind sharpened, his vision widened. Yet deep inside, he knew knowledge was useless unless he wielded it. Knowledge without action he muttered one morning, slamming the book shut, is like fuel in a locked tank. So he acted. Daniel stepped out into the city streets, the chill of the morning air slapping his face, reminding him again, life owes you nothing. He knocked on doors. Some slammed in his face. Others ignored him completely. But a few cracked open, and through those cracks he began to crawl. He worked odd jobs, anything he could get his hands on. He cleaned greasy floors in restaurants where the smell of food mocked his empty stomach. He carried boxes in warehouses until his arms ached like they were splitting apart. He repaired old furniture for strangers who barely remembered his name. And with every blister, every aching muscle, he told himself, this is temporary. This is the price of my future. Every coin he earned, he put aside. Not for new clothes, not for cigarettes, not for nights out to forget his misery. He refused to waste a single dollar. That money was sacred. That money was a seed. And Daniel was determined to plant it in the soil of his dreams. His friends didn't understand. They saw him bent over, sweating for pennies, skipping nights out, rejecting the illusion of temporary pleasure. They mocked him, laughed at him, shook their heads with pity disguised as humor. You're crazy, man, they jeered one night as he walked past them to the library instead of the bar. You'll always be broke. That's just life. Some people are rich, most people are not. Accept it. But Daniel refused to swallow that poison again. He had tasted hopelessness, and he knew it was a drug that killed slowly. He turned to them with eyes sharper than they had ever seen and said, the world will doubt you until the day you prove them wrong, and then they'll pretend they believed in you all along. That line echoed in his chest like thunder. His friends laughed, but deep down they felt it too. His fire was different. His hunger was something they couldn't joke away. He went home that night and wrote the sentence on his wall with a black marker, bold and permanent. Each morning when he woke, those words stared back at him, reminding him of the silent contract he had signed with his own destiny. His body ached, his bank account crawled, but his spirit grew taller. With each odd job, each new skill, each book devoured, Daniel was no longer the man with holes in his shoes and cracks in his dreams. He was becoming a warrior armed with discipline, and discipline, he realized, was more valuable than gold, because gold can be stolen. But discipline makes a man unstoppable. Daniel didn't just want to survive anymore. He wanted to rise, and that rise had already begun, quietly, painfully, invisibly. While the world still laughed, Daniel was building something far greater than wealth. He was building himself. And when a man builds himself, the world eventually has no choice but to notice. Part 3, The War Against Comfort. Months passed, and though Daniel's apartment still bore the same cracked walls, the same flickering light bulb, and the same second-hand couch with springs poking out like rusty nails, something inside that space had changed. The transformation wasn't in the peeling paint or the broken tiles, but in Daniel himself. His life, which had once been a graveyard of excuses, was now a battlefield of victories. His bank account, once bleeding red numbers that screamed debt, was slowly beginning to breathe. It wasn't overflowing with riches yet, but the sight of it no longer made his stomach twist with shame. His skills had sharpened like a soldier's blade. Where once he was fumbling in ignorance, now he could repair, build, negotiate, and sell. His network was widening too. People who had once ignored him now answered his calls because he had something of value to offer. But the greatest change was invisible. It wasn't the money, it wasn't the growing list of connections. It was the discipline. Daniel had forged a warrior's discipline, the kind that turns ordinary men into legends. He woke before dawn, not because he wanted to, but because he refused not to. He worked when his hands were bleeding, not because it was easy, but because stopping was no longer an option. And yet, just as his fire burned brightest, comfort came knocking at his door. It came dressed in 1,000 disguises. The urge to sleep in. You deserve rest. The temptation to waste money on little pleasures. Just buy it. You've earned it. The sly whisper that said, but doing better now, relax. Slow down. Comfort was clever, seductive, and patient. But Daniel had learned a deadly truth. Comfort was the assassin of greatness. He slammed the door on it every time it tried to slip through the cracks of his mind. He told himself out loud, fists clenched, I didn't come this far to stop halfway. That single sentence became his shield. Instead of slowing down, Daniel pushed harder. He started a side business reselling secondhand electronics. At first, it was nothing glamorous. He scavenged old laptops, battered phones, broken consoles, things people threw away. He sat for hours repairing them with trembling hands and tired eyes. The first time he made a profit, just $20, it felt like he had struck gold. The second time, $50, it felt like a victory parade. Soon, the numbers began to add up. What started as a small hustle grew into something bigger. Shockingly, he was earning more from this side business than from his regular job. But success, as he quickly learned, was never a straight line upward. It came with battles that tested his vow, trials that clawed at his resolve. His old car broke down, not once, but twice, leaving him stranded on freezing nights with grease-covered hands and an empty wallet. His landlord, impatient with late rent and deaf to excuses, threatened eviction, pounding at his door like a hammer. And worst of all, in the middle of an important project for a client, his laptop crashed, screen flickering into blackness just as he was about to deliver. Each time, the temptation to give up screamed inside his skull. Each time, exhaustion tried to seduce him into surrender. There were nights when he wanted to collapse, curse the world, and ask why it seemed everything was stacked against him. But then, the memory of his vow struck him like lightning. He would remember the mirror from that December morning, the face of the man who swore never to be poor again. And that memory poured fire into his veins. He would grit his teeth and whisper, pain is temporary. Quitting makes it permanent. Those words weren't just a mantra, they were a lifeline. When his car broke down, he walked miles to keep his commitments. When his landlord barked threats, he negotiated with dignity, scraping every coin he had to buy more time. When his laptop betrayed him, he borrowed an old one from a friend, staying up 2 nights straight to redo the project from scratch. Each setback became another brick in the wall of his resilience. Every obstacle was not the end of his road, but a test of how much he wanted to keep walking. There were moments, though, when Daniel broke down in silence. Alone in his apartment, he would stare at the ceiling, fists pressed into his eyes, body trembling from exhaustion. He was no superhero. He was a man, fragile and human, fighting battles most would never see. But he reminded himself of a truth few dared to live by. A warrior is not the one who always wins, but the one who never stops fighting. And Daniel refused to stop. As weeks turned into months, he noticed something remarkable. With every hardship he survived, he was growing tougher, sharper, harder to break. The man who once trembled at overdue bills now stared down landlords without flinching. The man who once hesitated to knock on doors now spoke with confidence. The man who once lived on instant noodles was now earning enough to choose differently, though he still lived frugally, saving for the empire he envisioned. Daniel realized that success wasn't about escaping the storm. It was about becoming the storm. And in his war against comfort, Daniel was no longer the boy who surrendered to excuses. He was a fighter, scarred, tired, but unstoppable, because he understood one unshakable truth: comfort is where dreams go to die. And Daniel's dreams were only just being born. Part 4, The Breakthrough. One rainy night, after finishing a late delivery, Daniel sat quietly in his tiny car outside a cafe. The wipers dragged across the windshield, squeaking against the mist, while drops of water blurred the neon lights outside. Inside the cafe, through the glass, he noticed two men in sharp suits leaning across the table, papers spread out, coffee steaming between them. Their voices carried faintly into the night. Investment, returns, expansion. Daniel wasn't just watching two men talk. He was staring at a mirror of the future he wanted. They weren't simply businessmen. To him, they were living proof of what discipline, risk, and vision could create. And in that moment, he whispered to himself, "That's going to be me." That vision sparked something dangerous, something bold, almost reckless. But Daniel knew that the line between reckless and revolutionary was courage. He gathered every single cent he had scraped together over the past year, the money that was supposed to be his safety net, and he threw it into the fire of risk. He rented a small, dimly lit workshop, its walls cracked, but its potential endless. He bought better tools, machines that hummed with possibility. He ran late-night ad campaigns online, pouring in not just money but his hunger, his story, his blood. People around him shook their heads. Friends warned him, "You'll lose everything." "What if it all collapses?" they said. Daniel didn't flinch. His answer cut through the air like steel. "What if it works?" And then it did. The first week, orders trickled in like cautious footsteps. The second week, they doubled. By the third, it was a flood. His workshop, once a hollow space with only his echo for company, buzzed with the sound of machines and the chatter of assistants he had hired. First 2, then 5. His hands, once used to scrubbing rust off old electronics in his cramped apartment, now commanded a growing operation. For the first time in his life, his bank account wasn't just escaping disaster. It was sprinting ahead. His debts were gone, and in their place stood something far more powerful: momentum. Every morning when he opened the workshop door, he felt it, the air charged with possibility, the smell of fresh ambition thick in the room. And in the quiet of his mind, a new truth was carved into stone. Your leap of faith will scare you, but staying where you are should terrify you more. Daniel had leaped, and the ground hadn't swallowed him. It had risen to meet him. Part 5, The New Man. 2 years after that freezing December morning, Daniel found himself in a place he once thought existed only in daydreams. He wasn't delivering packages anymore. He was delivering opportunities. From standing in the shadows of other men's offices, he now stood in his own, a space with glass walls, sunlight pouring in, and a view of the city skyline that reminded him daily of how far he had come. The man who once counted coins for bread now signed checks that carried weight, not just for him, but for dozens of families who depended on his business. His life had shifted from survival to significance. The leather shoes on his feet weren't just polished. They were symbols of battles fought and won. The overflowing fridge wasn't just food. It was security, freedom, proof that scarcity no longer ruled his nights. But here's the truth. Daniel's biggest transformation wasn't reflected in his wardrobe, his bank balance, or his new office. The true revolution had taken place inside. He was no longer the man waiting for luck, praying for miracles, or wishing for someone to save him. He had become the man who built bridges, created opportunities, and sparked change. Daniel never forgot the nights of hunger, the silence of an empty fridge, and the crushing weight of being told he wasn't enough. Instead of burying those memories, he used them as fuel. They became his compass, a reminder of what he never wanted to go back to, and a fire that kept him pushing forward. That's why he gave back. He donated to charities, yes, but he did more than write checks. He mentored young dreamers. He hired people who had been written off by the world, and he shared his scars openly. Not to boast, not to elevate himself, but to prove that the climb was possible, even for the ones standing at the very bottom. Daniel's philosophy had crystallized into a single unshakable belief. Poverty begins in the mind before it shows up in the pocket. The chains were not just financial, they were mental. And the moment you broke those invisible chains, the rest of the world had no choice but to follow. So here's the raw truth. If you're watching this right now, maybe your walls are cracked like his once were. Maybe your wallet feels lighter than your hope. Maybe the voices around you keep insisting that you're destined to stay stuck where you are. But maybe, just maybe, today is not like every other day. Maybe today is the day you plant your flag and declare, I will never be poor again. Because Daniel's story isn't just his. It's a mirror, a challenge, and an invitation. The choice is yours. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.